My next step is to add some ripples in this flag to simulate the wind. Now, I'm eventually going to deform this flag and and give it a little bit of physical deformation. But for now, I just want to put a little bit of superficial deformation on here, which I'm going to do with a bump map. The map that I'm going to want to use is a water texture, which is right here. And you can see that the water texture is a little grayscale. It's a little grayscale indication of ripples, embossed ripples, dark and light, and they create this kind of water look. So I'm going to middle mouse click and drag this right on top of my blend material, and down here I'm going to select bump map. And what happens is Maya creates automatically another node right here. It's called a bump node. And what the bump node does is it takes the grayscale value, or the alpha actually, of this water texture and uses that as the value of the bump. And then it adds another attribute called the bump depth, and it actually multiplies. It takes the bump value here and it multiplies it by the bump depth. That's now assigned to this flag, and if I do a render, it's really almost imperceptible. I can just start to see a little bit of bump on here, but it's not really doing very much for me at all. So what I need to do is make some adjustments to the parameters of this. So before I do, I want to clean up a little bit. I'm going to take my my water texture here, and I'm going to click on my show input and output connections. I don't need to see any of that color information anymore, and this just shows me that direct dependency here. Now, in looking at my water texture, I have several attributes in the attribute editor that I might want to adjust. The wave amplitude is the attribute that's going to increase the contrast between the waves. Since the bump map is dependent on the dark and light and the contrast in between, I think it's the wave amplitude that I want that's going to actually accent this bump. So you can start to see that I'm getting a little bit more action, or a little more activity here in the bump map. So that's what I want. I can make life a little more easy, or a little easier on myself, by making a couple of quick adjustments here. When I look at the renderer, I'm looking at my hardware display through this high resolution renderer called Viewport 2.0, and that shows me everything. It also taxes my system resources a little bit more than I might want, depending on how much graphics RAM you have and so forth. I'm going to click on the default quality rendering, and you can see that I get a very low res image here. When I click on the blend material, and I'm going to scroll down here to this hardware texturing drop down, and you can see that my textured channel is color. Now that I have a number of different inputs to this blend, I can choose which of those inputs I want to see. And I'm going to scroll down here and select bump, and that's going to show me the layout of this bump map. I can also take my texture resolution and change it right in the shader. So I can turn this to either a high resolution or the highest, and that's going to show me exactly how this bump is arranged. So this is going to show me what the ripples are going to be on my flag. So I can go ahead and start to adjust this. I'll go into the placement node, and I can rotate the frame. And this is I think this is what I want to do. When I rotate the frame, kind of like this, my ripples are going to go at an angle, which is going to simulate the wind a little bit more to my liking. So now you can start to see that I'm getting these kind of angled ripples here. I can also increase the wave frequency. The wave frequency right now it's set at 4. If I increase that to, I don't know, 5 or 6, you'll see that I'm going to get more. I'll get more ripples in there, and then as I adjust the wave amplitude, and you can play around obviously with the sub wave frequency, you're going to get little additional wrinkles in there. My goal is to create these kind of ripples which are going to supplement an actual physical deformation of this flag. So I'm not going to go too crazy with it. There are a couple of things I'd like to point out. Um, One is that within this render window, I've been using this test render button. There are a couple of other things that you can do. You can draw a region here and have that automatically render. So you can just pick up a little spot on here. In order to enable that, you have to go into your options here and make sure that auto render region is enabled. The other thing that you have is this fourth icon here has a little label on it that says IPR. That stands for the Interactive Photorealistic Renderer. And one of the features of this IPR renderer is that it will update your shaders automatically in the render. So let me show you what I mean. I'll click on the IPR and it initially does a render and prompts me to select a region to begin tuning. So I'll pick, most of the flag here, and it will refresh. If I change my wave amplitude from 0.4, say, to 0.5, my renderer is going to update for me. Let's go to 0.8, and you can see that I got a real tight, real heavy render here. Then if I take my my wave frequency and I drop that down to, say, 4, you can see that my render is updating as I go. There's a couple things you want to be careful of. I would advise against moving these sliders because since the renderer is trying to update with every new input, if there's any hesitation in your hand as you're moving the slider, it's going to get all caught up and trip over itself as it's trying to render and re-render and re-render and re-render. The other thing I want to point out is up here you can see that the IPR render here is 45 megabytes. This is a just a regular 640 by 480 and really should be about 1 meg. But there's so much information in the IPR that this creates a very large file. So we're going to have to go back and delete those after the fact. But it's a handy thing to have when you're adjusting a shader like this. So while we're at it, we can start to see this specular highlight here. So I can go into my blend specular attributes and I can adjust things like my eccentricity and my specular roll off. And I can make that a wide specular or a fairly narrow specular. I'm breaking my own rule here by moving this slider, but I'm being very careful of it. Okay, so you can do something like that. Or if you want to take a look at your lights, I'll go back in here. I'll switch my my top to lights. I'm going to pick my yellow spotlight. I'll look at the input and output connections of that in my work area, and I can start adjusting the color of this. So I think that it might be a little bit too yellow, so I'll make it a little bit more pale. And I can also change the intensity, and then I can take my other light and change the intensity of that one. So there's a lot that I can do from within the Hypershade window. Let's go back to our materials here. I'm going to select my flag, right click in here, say graph materials on selected objects. That's going to give me my graph again. And again, looking at the bump map, I'll just select the water texture and show my inputs and outputs, and that's going to refresh what I'm looking at. So there's one thing I want to point out here on my render. Notice that even though I have that really nice rippling across the surface, when I get to the edge, I really see nothing. And that's one of the drawbacks of using a bump map. It does nothing to the geometry. It keeps the geometry flat and square or rectangular, and it only disturbs the way that we see the surface through the lens of the camera. One of the other visual attributes that I see that I don't particularly like is the fact that this flag is really, really shiny and smooth. I want to have a little bit of indication that this is cloth. I want to put some wrinkles in it. I don't feel as though the ripples are enough. So in order to do that, I want another bump map. So you'll get used to choosing which ones of these you might want to use. A fractal is always a good one because when you look at the way that this fractal is generated, we're going to see a lot of wrinkling in here. There's a little bit of a problem because if I grab this fractal and I drag it over to my blin and I add that as another bump map, what happens is my original bump map is disconnected. I'm going to get a kind of a nice fractally bump on here, but my ripples are gone. So I need to devise a way that I can add the fractal to the existing bump map. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's just undo this. And I've got my fractal in here. The first thing I want to do is create a bump map out of this fractal manually. So instead of connecting it and having this bump node automatically generated, I can come over here and look in my utilities section and find a bump 2D node. It's a standalone node. When I drag and drop the fractal onto the bump 2D, just click on default and Maya knows exactly what to do. It connects the out alpha to the bump value right there. Now let's take a look at the connection that's made between the original bump map and the material itself. The connection that's made is the out normal to the normal camera. And that just refers to the fact that the bump map perturbs the normals of the surface and causes the camera to misinterpret their direction, which gives them that embossed look. So what I'm going to do then is grab my secondary bump map, middle mouse click on it, and drag it on top of my original bump map. Now Maya has no idea what even to suggest for this. So there's no default. What I want to do is click on Other. This is going to bring up my connection editor. So incidentally, if you did suggest or you did choose default, it would bring up the connection editor anyway. So over here on the left, here's my out normal, and that's the output of the bump map that I want. And what I need to do is connect it to the normal camera of this bump 2D. That normal camera is not displayed by default, and what I need to do is go over to my right display menu and say Show Hidden. That's going to expand this to show a whole new menu of hidden nodes, and right over here is my normal camera. So I connect my out normal to the normal camera, and what that does is creates another connection, and it feeds my bump 2D, my fractal bump, right into my water bump, and it will mix those two in whatever configuration I want. So let's render that, and you can see that I'm getting the fractal and I'm getting the ripples. So now it's just a matter of adjusting these two. So one thing I could do is take this secondary bump node and take the bump depth and drop that down to a 0.5 maybe. Let's just do a little bit of maintenance here. I'll make that a little smaller. I'll make this a little bigger, and I'll do an IPR render. So if I take my bump depth here and I make that 0, I'll have no effect. And then if I go to, say, a 0.25, that's going to give me a little bit of an effect. Let's take the water texture and bring that down to 0 so we can just start evaluating the fractal. So I'll bring this back up to maybe a 0.5. And I kind of like it, but I think it's a little bit too broad. So here's something that I can do in the placement node. On my repeat U and V, I can cause this square fractal texture to duplicate itself and repeat more than once in either direction. So let's go to a 2, and we can go to a 2 here. And now you can see that the same texture is now tiling along this surface. So let's try maybe a 6 here, okay? And we can take our bump depth and bring that down. And then we can take the repeat in V and make that 0.5 so we can stretch it out. And then we can take our frame and rotate it just a little bit. And that's going to give us a little bit of secondary ripple here. So then I'm going to go back to my first bump and make that bump depth the default of 1. You can see that I'm starting to get a little bit of a combination here. I probably want to make this a little less, and I probably want to make this one a little less. Okay, so that's going to give me a nice subtle look on here. And I can continue to do this and add additional bump maps to this by choosing a 2D texture. So let's take a cloth texture. And then we can manually connect it to the bump map of its own by going to the Utilities, select the Bump 2D, and connect it. And then we can take this bump and connect it to now our secondary bump. And here, if I select default, like I said before, it's still going to just bring up the connection editor. So I'll connect the out normal to the normal camera. And now you can see that this cloth texture is really, quite large. The cloth texture, when used as a bump, is going to bump out where it's white, bump in where it's gray, and you can see that it's a really big texture. So I can go back into my my coverage and my repeat, and instead of repeating it 4 by 4, let's try 12 by 12. Let's try even more. Let's go 48 by 48. And now you can see that I'm really starting to get that cloth look, okay, on this. So I like the look. It's just a little bit too strong for me. So again, I'll rotate this frame a little bit just to give it a little bit of an offset there. And there's a couple things I can do. I can change the gap color and the U and the V color here, or I can just change the bump depth. So I'll just go with like a 0.2, and then I'll take the gap color and I'll make that about a 50% gray. That's going to change the contrast in here fairly substantially. Let's go back and change this bump depth again, 0.05. So now with my flag, let's just do a quick render here. I've got multiple bump maps on there. I've got one for the ripple. I've got one for kind of a secondary ripple. I have one for a little bit of a cloth texture. All of these are picking up the specular highlight. And so they're accented a little bit more where the light is hitting them and where they're most in shadow. So I kind of like that look. I'm going to keep it. I can add a little bit of displacement to this, and I might want to use my original water texture so that my displacement lines up with my ripples. That's a choice I can make. So let's start out with that. I'm going to select this water texture and click on Edit, Duplicate with its connections to the network. And what that will do is duplicate this water texture and keep the placement node exactly the same. Now, I have no place to connect a displacement map in the shader. The displacement map is one of the few things that actually takes place in the shader group node. So down here I have my surface material, and here I have my displacement material. So I can drag this water texture down here to the displacement material, and that also creates a secondary node, which is my displacement node. When I render this, I'm going to get a completely wild, over-the-top displacement because the amplitude of this water texture is way too high, and the scale of my displacement is also way too high. So let's take this amplitude back down, 0.05 maybe. and we'll do a quick render, and you can see that it's starting to displace around the edges. Let's bring it up a little bit higher and we'll take a look at it. So we'll go to, say, a 0.1. So now you can see that the edges here are starting to displace. The displacement map actually does displace the geometry. So the combination of the displacement map along with the ripples is giving me the full flag effect. So perhaps I don't want this displacement map to line up with my ripples. So what I would need is another placement node. So in my utilities, I have a 2D placement node that's a standalone node. I can drag and drop that right on top of the default connection here. And now this is back to the original configuration, and that's going to line up my displacement map. So I have now displacement that's working in one direction. I have my ripples that are going in another direction. And then I have my secondary and third bump map here lining everything up.